I'm going to read a thing that Matt wrote about herself because I love this so much from one of her social media pages. And then I'm just going to say a couple of things and we're going to jump into the conversation. So this is what Matt wrote about herself. She said, I have a PhD in dramatic theology and spend my time pondering the meaning of stories and texts, seeking wisdom in unexpected places, learning to ask better questions, laboring over my words, taking photographs of every little thing, feeling all the feelings, and drinking copious amounts of chai. That's a perfect introduction to Matt Downey. Matt is an author and a teacher. She is most recently crushing it on all the social medias. She's married to Dean and their home is in Montreal, but they live in the whole world. Matt's been a guide and an inspiration and an encouragement and friend for me and Donna for a lot of years now, more than I want to admit. And I am very glad to be able to have this conversation with her and all the rest of you about her new book, Go Wide. It should be probably like that, Go Wide. So please, with your microphones muted, give an uproarious applause to welcome Matt Downey.
Thank you. I hear it all. I feel it all.
Well, thanks, Matt. Thanks for being here. Thanks for your book. This has been such a joy to read. It's been there's just so many places where you have written so many beautiful things in this book. Those moments where I remember a few years ago when I read Miroslav Volf's Exclusion and Embrace, and there was a section I came to in the book where he's talking about the prodigal son, and I remember it was the first time I'd ever wept in reading a theological book. And I had I've had a similar experience. There are paragraphs in Go Wide that are just like feasts for your soul, and I can tell that you labor over the words. These aren't just things that you're splattering onto these pages. These are such well-crafted and beautiful words in this that are the kind of theology, the kind of expression of theology I think that we desperately need in these days. So thank you.
Thanks for having me.
All right, now I'm going to start throwing the hard questions at you. You ready?
Okay.
So the title for your book is Go Wide. Well, we're living in a time where it feels like we're in a rush to go narrow, to define people out of our lives, kick churches out of our denominations over differences of interpretation, reduce our Kodachrome world to just colors like red and blue. And it seems like in this book, you're inviting us to a way of living that's going against the church world culture. It's going against contemporary human culture. So my first question is, did you ever think of calling your book Go Just a Little Less Narrow?
No, I didn't think of that title, but Viable says kind of the same thing, but in a negative way, maybe. The idea of Go Wide, I mean, it went through several iterations, the title, but it was always had this idea of wideness in it. And it basically comes from, I grew up on the Canadian prairies where you can see for miles and kilometers and kilometers and kilometers. And it's like the endless expanse of horizon. And that's one of my favorite things about the prairies and the prairie sky, which it just seems endless. And so I have a great appreciation for this expansiveness. But in my world, which was a conservative Mennonite community, it seemed quite narrow. So I lived in a quite narrow place while living in a wide place. And I found the same thing in the church. It was very clear who was an outsider and who was an insider. And then I began to study theology, before I even studied theology within the church, and you hear about this three-tiered universe, basically. So we have heaven above, then we have humanity or the world, and then you have hell below, and it's vertical. And the higher you go, the better things are, the closer you are to God. And so it's always, you're trying to transcend and move up the ladder, so to speak, not just socially or however, but even theologically, spiritually, you're trying to move up the ladder. And basically, that was really proving to be unsatisfactory for me in many ways. It had me feeling quite claustrophobic, actually, internally. So the inside wasn't matching the outside. And so one of the things I did, because in graduate school, you're invited to ask questions and experiment and think and what if we did this? And one of the questions I had is, what if we just get rid of hierarchy altogether? In theology, what would that look like? Is that even, could we do that? What would it do to our concept of God? Would it kind of destroy our concept of God? Because we're always thinking of God as a single over everything else, having power over everything else.
Right.
Very much reflected in our language of the sovereign God, the almighty God, King of kings, Lord of lords, the one God over all. And I thought, what if we are not allowed to think in hierarchical terms? How would you then do theology? How would you then read and interpret the biblical texts? How would we then live with each other? And that was kind of my question going in. So not just, I appreciate your little less narrow, but I just thought, let's go for it all. Let's just go see how far we can stretch ourselves and go as wide as our mind, our hearts, our spirits, and our courage will allow us to.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think you do that. I think you lead us in this book into that experiment ourselves. I think it's impossible, or at least it seems impossible to me, to read this and not be provoked to your own pondering. Then you get sucked into that experiment of thinking differently. But I think there's also the scary side for us, or there can be a scary side for us, because we've always been told, or if we've been in church world for a long time, we've been told that the way is narrow. There's only going to be a few who can fit through that door. And if we're not careful, we're going to fall off that narrow way into the gaping chasm of damnation that waits for us below. So isn't narrow the way of Jesus?
That's a really good question. And read chapter 1, and I answer all of that. Buy the book, read the book. No, but I take a look at that because I think in chapter 1, because I think that's the first obstacle or objection that people, or hurdle that people might have who are familiar with that passage. And it has been drilled into us, narrow. I have a visual in my mind of Sunday school pictures where there's a narrow road, a narrow path, and there's a big, broad road. And here we have all those terrible heathens going off on this big broad road, but those few people who find that narrow winding road, they're the fortunate ones that Jesus has found, or we have found Jesus. But when you take a closer look at that passage, it actually says narrow is the gate that leads to life. It's not the whole road. So I talk about this whole idea of constriction and restriction being a temporary thing that we go through when we transition from one location to another. So a shepherd or a sheep going from through a narrow gate to get into a wide open pasture. Like, you're not supposed to get stuck in the gate. That's a really bad place to be stuck in. We are invited into wideness, but of course there is constriction and restriction that we go through in different points in our lives, that when we go through transitions or move from one location to another. And I think that is what Jesus is referring to, because he says narrow is the gate. He doesn't say narrow is the way. So I use the metaphor or add to the metaphor of a birth canal. So narrow is the birth canal that leads to life. We're not meant to get stuck in that birth canal and say, this is my entire life forward, just to be in this very, very narrow, restrictive place. No, this is a narrow thing, birth pangs, so to speak, that even creation is said to be going through in search or moving toward a fullness. And then we are to be moving into fullness and experiencing the wideness of life.
And do you think that that's, well, do you see ways in which the contemporary church today is specifically perpetuating that concept of narrowness in our belief and in our practice.
I think it's throughout all of church history, and
Yeah.
even before that. In the Hebrew Bible, you had this concept of the chosen people, and that being being interpreted as being, oh, it's just us that are chosen, and no one else, and we're the select few. Instead of finishing that promise from God, saying, "I've chosen you to be a blessing to all the nations." There's this constriction that's supposed to spread out into blessing for the whole world, and I think we're just stuck at that because in some way it's attractive to us, and I guess we would have to interrogate ourselves about why we like these narrow things. There's the comfort of I think certainty in smallness, because it's everything that we see or have around us is very familiar and we know it. Whereas as soon as you start to go wide and outside of your comfort zone and outside of people that share your specific beliefs or your life experiences, you encounter discomfort. You are challenged to kind of adapt what you know because you're encountering things that you don't know. So I think in that way, we like to keep it small and familiar and narrow just for our own comfort and our own certainty, and to our detriment, I would say as well.
Yeah, and in your book, you and several times you talk about and maybe I'm connecting things that shouldn't be connected, but you talk about the idea of, let's say, certainty with the approach that we really seem to find in scripture, which is rather than definition, simile and metaphor. And our there seems to be this want in us to define things, and yet you're saying in the book, really, as soon as we have latched onto that definition that gives us that sense of certainty, we've certainly missed God. That there's a way in which we've missed God. And could you say a little bit more about how you feel simile and metaphor is a healthier way to have a conversation, and to be thinking about God and what God is like?
Sure. And I think some of that has to do with the world or the culture and the time that we live in a modern or postmodern age, which is very scientifically factual oriented, not a big storytelling culture like some other cultures would be. So we don't use that many metaphors. We find them imprecise in some ways, just because we want something very narrow and defined. And the problem is as soon as you're dealing with encounter and community and relationship and living organisms, this being able to pinpoint things down is really, really difficult. And metaphor and story are tools that open things up instead of pin things down. So they invite you to consider, like, I think it's a song, maybe it's a poem, "Love is a Rose." Or so we're going, ooh, it immediately engages us, and we have to start thinking, well, how is love like a rose? Well, it's not that it's prickly. Oh, maybe it is. I don't know. Are there thorns? Is it growing? Is it like, we're engaged and we're thinking,
Right.
instead of
Yeah.
giving me a simple definition where now I can judge everything else by whether it fits or not. I have been engaged to think, and to consider my own experience, to learn from others' experience, and really expand how I think of love, because, oh, I didn't think of that before. And that's what metaphor does. It really opens things up and gives us much more kaleidoscope kind of way of looking at something, instead of that's the pinpoint, that's it. There's a kaleidoscope of colors to consider and view from different angles. And I think in thinking about God, very often what the church, at least the Western church, and we have done in theology as well, is try to pinpoint God and define things. We try to define the Trinity. Like, why would you do that? I don't try to define Dean. I can tell you some characteristics, but it's ongoing. There's an encounter that's unfolding. And
Right.
that's the joy of it, right?
Yeah.
It's not that I've discovered everything and there it is, final definition, because it's a person, it's a relationship. So
Yeah.
the same things happen when we encounter God, when we try to define things about who God is or what the Trinity is, we're just narrowing things so far down that we've lost the essence in many ways. But
Yeah.
it gives us a certain satisfaction, I think, because now we can go, we know the truth, we found it, we've
Right.
settled on it. Instead of, I mean, you even look at how Jesus communicated so often. Favorite thing, asking questions. Another favorite thing, telling stories. Another favorite thing, walking around the world and pointing at agricultural items as they walk and going, look at that, and all the lessons to be learned in. There's a field of wheat, look at that,
Yeah.
and all the things to draw from that. So we've kind of lost that in the theological world, and I think perhaps in the church world as well.
Yeah. Yeah. And I wonder if that, okay, I'm getting ahead of myself. I want to talk about transcendent and immanent. I do think there's some things about the nature of some metaphor and story that makes things imminent, or yeah, that makes things imminent for us, the kind of get your hands dirty. But let me come back to that. You talk in the book, or a major theme of the book from my reading is community. How does our belonging in community, interaction with the community, the presence of community in our lives, how do you see that intersecting with our relationship with God in terms of going wide? And yeah, let's start there. What's the importance of a community of others in our relationship with God? Aren't we better Christians if we're monks and we isolate ourselves and protect ourselves?
Well, even monks live in community, so what are you going to do? Um, yeah, I kind of what I say in the book is if we don't start with God as community, then we can't function well as followers of Jesus in community, because we've thought of God as a monolith in many
Mm,
ways, a single entity, a single being. Then we don't think of ourselves as community belongers. We think ourselves as more individuals. And I think that is problematic. So to take it back and say, we have to start thinking of God as community. So putting a Trinitarian base on everything. And once you say everything has to fit through that lens of Trinitarian encounter, where you have a community that functions in reciprocation, in mutual giving and receiving, in mutual submission in that way, and honoring the other, and recognizing diversity, but knowing that we all act as one. So very often you have nouns for God that are plural, but the verb is singular. So this idea of there are more people involved, but they act in one singular mission. And so I think, well, if we have to dwell in community, what is our model? Or is there something that we can kind of can walk with us, someone? And I think Trinitarian thinking for me is a good starting point.
mm,
And when I do this in, I think, chapter 7, I look at some atonement models, and they're
right.
so completely, maybe that's an overstatement, un-Trinitarian, which is why
Right.
they have proved to be so actually even harmful, but so ill-fitting and so unhelpful in how we think about how we are people who are continually needing rescuing and how that rescuing happens.
Hmm.
I don't know
Yeah.
if I answered your question specifically, but
Yeah, yeah, definitely, and I think that's another theme that I want to talk about too is Trinity. And for me, you know, I've read a lot of systematic theology, and I usually find myself yelling at systematic theology books. And this was a time where I was reading, you know, what you're offering as a systematic theology, that I found myself really not yelling at it, but saying, you know, oh yes, like that makes sense. This actually sounds like God, like this. You know, there's a greater sense of consistency when that lens of Trinity um, is what we're looking through. And one example of that in the book, you talk about the two stories of creation in Genesis and how they illustrate the tension between the transcendent God, who's above everything, that sovereign God, and then the immanent God in the second story, who gets their hands dirty in the act of creation. And I'm just wondering if you could maybe talk to us a little bit about the importance of that second creation story and what it reveals about the immanence of God.
Yeah. And I'm not trying to say the two stories are necessarily in tension. I just say they give us two different perspectives. So definitely God as transcendent and other than all of creation in some way. But then you get the same downward kind of impulse that you find in the incarnation, is the same impulse to, but I want to be really, really close to the creation, because this is where my heart beats. This is where everything gets enfleshed I'm speaking as the Trinity now, which I probably shouldn't. But yeah, this idea of I see a desire for the divine community to be very, very close in community with humanity, with all of creation, to be to get divine hands dirty, as I say, to be grounded and in the ground, making the ground holy in many ways. And we see that in a few times in the scriptures where the ground is said to be holy, so infused with the presence of the divine. So it's not that the divine always needs to be up above and separate from, but really infused in the very groundedness of humanity and creation and all that we know in our existence. And the story is a little problematic because the first story is very perfect. It has such a liturgical structure and a momentum that builds, and that's fine. But the second story, it's like, oh, this isn't good, and this isn't good. We got to fix this problem. And how do we address that? Well, we'll try this. No, that didn't work. Let's try another thing. And then, so it just sounds very different, where it's almost like a collaboration instead of something just happening from one divine being from above. There's a collaboration. We'll figure it out as we go in order to ensure that everything is very, very good.
Yeah. Yeah, and that introduces another word that I think is a theme throughout the book, which is solidarity. That the Trinity is choosing solidarity, over and over again. When you read it that way, you're seeing from the very beginning, it's about the Trinity choosing solidarity with the creation, and that's I would say traditionally. I've been taught a more adversarial position, that God creates, but immediately we mess it up, and now we're the Old Testament is the waiting until God steps back in to set things right. Where you're presenting in the book, from the text, a very different picture of an immanent God who's engaged throughout that story in being revealing himself or revealing God's self as God with us. So God with us becomes a big theme as well.
Yeah, and I think one of the chapters is focused on movement, because very often I think how the scriptures were interpreted and taught to me was that we're looking for the moral here, or the truth, or a guideline, or a principle, or an action. That's what we're looking for. Very simple, and it takes so much, empties the stories out of so much when we're just looking for, and what's the point? What's the moral of the story? It's so simple, oversimplified. And I think if you would like watch a Shakespeare play and at the end you go, what's the moral of the story? It's like, we kind of missed the point. Like, you were supposed to like engage with the characters, see parts of yourself in the characters, and the tension and how the difficult choices they have to make. So this idea of solidarity, I really like that you picked up on that theme, because I think this is always the impulse I see is always God wanting to come near and nearer and nearer and nearer. And when things go wrong, God comes near again. And we find that especially with Jesus going through society, and all the stories we have from him in the Gospels, about him in the Gospels, is Jesus wanting to be near people and near people that other people didn't want to be near to. So this
Right.
idea of solidarity is a kind of a side by side in which relates to the immanence, instead of a God being over people and needing them to do what God wants them to do. There's this idea of we're side by side and I want to be near. I want to draw near. The kingdom wants to draw near.
Right.
Um, so not just God's presence, but the whole way that God orders and is with others, that's what wants to come near as well.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, and you write this. There's a beautiful section. I mean, there are several beautiful sections, but there's this beautiful section in the book where you talk about Jesus and two women, and one is in Luke 7, and the woman who comes and she's weeping on the feet of Jesus, and uh, uh, you offer these two women as signs of a different narrative to the one that we're used to, where God can't be around sinful people, but instead the picture we actually see is that Jesus leans in, and with the Syrophoenician woman, you're even saying Jesus humbles himself with this conversation with the Syrophoenician woman, and we see potentially an aspect of the Trinity at work that would be unexpected to us as if we're thinking only God as transcendent and God aloof from us, but instead you're showing Jesus demonstrating that God wants to be immanent for us. It's one of my favorite sections, but I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about how his interaction with these two women illustrates the big idea of the book of going wide, and what we can extract out of that for our own relationship with God.
Yeah, sure. And I think the idea of go wide, I like the title because it has a verb in it. So it's not just, again, it's a static truth. There we go, we got it. God is wide. That was one of the titles of the book at one point, and it was changed to be a more active title, which engages us and keep on going wide, right? This idea of movement, which is the chapter that you're talking about. And for the women, especially the Syrophoenician women, which is a problematic story, people have interpreted it in different ways. And Jesus basically insults her, and they don't know what to do with that. They downplay it because Jesus is perfect.
Right.
Supposedly. And I think, well, if Jesus is human, then Jesus is learning. If Jesus is a cultural Jew, then he knows cultural Jewish things, but maybe not Syrophoenician things, So just this idea of a learning Jesus as well is really difficult for some people to, was he born walking and toilet trained? Well, I don't think so. He had a learning curve like any other human did. And that shifts our idea of how to engage with God as well, that God would say, yes, I want to learn as well. That's part of the human experience. And but anyway, with the Syrophoenician woman, what I found interesting is when you look at it as a chiastic structure, which is the center of the story is where the meat, the gold, the gem of the story is. Jesus gives that to her. She gets to declare something that he personally has never declared, which is opening up the gospel and widening up the gospel to be beyond just the nation of Israel, beyond the Jews. And she kind of pries that door open. And when she does, Jesus gives it to her and just says, well, then you might as well declare it. You've pried this thing open. Why don't you declare it? And it makes her kind of the star, the spokesperson for that particular message in that particular story. So it's not even of, okay, I give you, here's healing for your daughter. I did what you asked because I'm a good God and I'm benevolent and I give people things. That's what I do. A little reluctantly this time, we had a little misunderstanding, but it's all fine. I gave it to you. No, he actually, the humility in that story, I think, of Jesus is quite astounding, that we we tend to not want to highlight because it makes us uncomfortable in some ways, not to have this sovereign, all-knowing God who, yeah, who just doesn't need to change in any way, even in the human experience.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And instead, then you're describing him. And I'm when I say you're describing him, I don't, you're not going outside the text. You're not making up an addendum to the text. You're just giving us a different lens, inviting us to look from a different perspective. It's as simple as that. It's just an invitation to look at it from a different perspective. And then all of a sudden you see, and you can think of a multiplicity then of instances where Jesus chose solidarity with the people, as you said, who people aren't supposed to show solidarity with. They're not the people we're supposed to gravitate towards, but they are the people Jesus gravitates towards, which says something about the Trinity and what our relationship with the Trinity is like. On page 55, you write, "It is tempting to question why Jesus does not simply eliminate the oppressive system of patriarchy, instead of extending healing, worth, and belonging in a piecemeal fashion, one person at a time." So let me give in to temptation and ask you, why didn't Jesus say, "Thou shalt not patriarchy"?
Yeah, why not? Um, and I don't have a definitive answer. I think I offer some thoughts in there,
Yeah.
but I think my question is always, because I am trained as a systematic theologian, a non-systematic systematic theologian, because system doesn't work for me. But I understand the desire to order things in a way that they can be understood a bit better. But I would say, what is my question then is, what does this tell me about God? That the system isn't eradicated and everything is made right. What does this tell me? That God goes person by person by person by person and somehow changes or offers them an invitation or a freedom or a rescue or a meal or a healing or a sense of belonging that they didn't have before, so that they can enter into community in a way that they didn't before. I
Mm,
think, well, that does tell me something about God.
yeah.
Instead of, again, from on high, changing everything and imposing that on people, there's this invitation one by one to change it, an interior kind of orientation, and then to let that work its way out. So I'm always noticing, what are the exceptions, like the chapter on patriarchy, what are the exceptions? Because patriarchy is so pervasive, even in our current times where we're more aware of it. It's so pervasive, and always looking, where are the exceptions? Where is it being undermined? Where are, like, there parentheses where there's a pause where it isn't inflicted on people, and then it goes back again. But looking for those exceptions and finding hope in them, and noticing that this God pays attention to individuals and treats them individually as well.
Mm, yeah, that's good. You wrote, "Reading the biblical text as a woman can be discouraging." Can you help us with that? I know my wife can she can feel that. Uh, for others of us with a different chromosome, what do you mean by that? And then I've got a follow-up question. But in what way can it be discouraging as a woman to read the biblical text?
Several ways. Number one, you're just not represented a whole lot. And you're, especially in the translations that we have, you're not represented very much at all in God. So despite in the very beginning, the first story being God's image is male and female, that being declared, females just kind of disappear from the genealogies, from the stories, from authority positions, from anything like that. And we see some of that come back more. And they're, again, the exceptional stories. So it's just discouraging not to see yourself represented
Mhm.
in many ways. It's discouraging to have God referred to in exclusively male, for the most part, exclusively male terms. and pronouns, which is part of the translation problem, I think.
Right.
And that's being recognized more, that male translators just assume that. But still, it's there, it's present. Um, and I think so. It's hard for me to imagine what does it mean to be in the image of God as a female?
Right.
It's not as clear. What does it mean for me to share in the authority of Jesus? So again, it's not clear because there's not that many women in authority, in leadership positions. And then women can just be painted as the problems in the
Hmm.
stories, right? Or sex objects, or they are the child bearers. Your job is to bring a male heir into the world. So it's very, very diminished, the role of women in the scriptures. And that can just be really discouraging when
Right.
you think there's so much more to the female experience than what is represented in these ancient texts.
Right. And in fact, you talk about in one section about the feminine side of God, wondering out loud if we've slipped into heresy about that, or to, suggest something like that. But then you break down, from the text that there are choices by translators to essentially ignore feminine case, and to translate when there are words about God, to translate those words in a way that eliminates the feminine. Can you just talk about that a little bit for us, and how you see that affecting then, kind of the emphasis on the maleness of God to the exclusion of the feminine of God? How does that impact the way not only we think of God, but how we think of ourselves?
Yeah, and I think it's just a product of who would have been writing down the stories. So, as far
Right.
as we know, they all would have been male writers, and who would have been translating them until very recently would have been all male scholars that would have been translating these. So, I think I don't know if I'm not going to. I don't know their intent, but I think that's just their world. They see themselves in their world, and that's how they translate something that relates to their world. I think if you would have had female translators and females telling the story, we would have quite different perspectives in many ways. So I'm sorry that that wasn't there. But I think, well, what is this? That's just, you can't change history. So what are you going to do? You're going to just address this present moment and say, how can we find a way to perhaps highlight what was in the story from the very beginning and
Right.
somehow got lost along the way. And I think looking at matriarchal cultures tells us a lot about what we could have been missing
Yeah.
because the world was ruled and dominated and written about,
Yeah.
and the stories were told about and by uh, men.
Right.
And so I think this is part of our job, and an exciting job it is too, I think, to have our imaginations expand in the idea of how we can relate to God in a way that is not so male centered.
Yeah. And throughout this book, you quote female women scholars, Bible scholars, authors. You curate some amazing quotes, and in my early education, my Bible college education, um, I I did not have a single book or that was written by a woman. Never certainly ever heard a female woman theologian, not a feminist, not a not none those people did not exist in my education background. But you curate some quotes that are just profound, deeply insightful theological observations throughout this book. What Who are some people that we should know that it's possible that as good Bible reading evangelicals, we've never heard of some of these women who are brilliant theologians and insightful writers?
Well, thanks for saying that. I was very intentional about my sources and my resources so that because as my theological education was heavily male and European. And so I have been very intentional about what I now read, who's on my news feed, who I hear from. Yeah, I have really, really downplayed all of the voices I've heard for most of my life, telling me what to think, basically, or in the theological world. So I've really downplayed that, saying I've heard a lot of that already. Let me hear from voices that are currently telling us a different perspective that we might not have heard. So I try to listen to Indigenous scholars, women scholars. If you want names, I mean, it changes for me all the time because
Sure.
fortunately, there's just new people on the horizon all the time coming up with such rich material. So most recently, Kat Armas is one of the one, Abuelita Faith, I believe she wrote, which is she's Hispanic, I believe, and just talks very much about her story and her family and how that informs how she does theological work. Lisa Sharon Harper is very much talks about racism and supremacy and like how power dynamics, and she's very in good. She's invested in that and active in that, and also very informed about that as well. Caitlin Curtis is someone that she's an Indigenous author, so I listen to her and read about her as well. Christina Cleveland has, pushes the envelope. I love it. She has a book called God is a Black Woman. I'm going, yes, like, come on, just invite us to really think differently about some of these almost tropes that we have of
Yeah.
God, only one way of seeing God. So
Yeah.
I think she has some very valuable insights as well. And the
Yeah.
thing I find about women theologians is that they are not as set on being objective or assuming that they
Yeah.
have an objective perspective. They recognize their social location, they recognize their life experience, and they say, this informs me and enriches who I am as a theologian and what
Yeah.
I come up with and how I act in the world.
Yeah.
It makes a difference where I'm situated. And they recognize that and they bring that in. And I think that's a piece that has been missing from the largely, male European viewpoint.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I think we could say, and I honestly, I will confess in saying this that I can't give you a list of names, but I think we could say the same thing about queer theologians. There's just a male centric, heterocentric, cis centric. There's just so much theology out there by a solid people that inside of our little bubbles we have never heard of, we've never had to wrestle with, we've never been able to see the beauty in or felt a challenge of. And I think there's just I think you've done a beautiful job in this book in giving us an invitation, a very accessible invitation into a world that's bigger than a lot of us have inhabited. And so I appreciate that. We're gonna go to questions from everybody else and stop recording here in just a second. So if you've been thinking and listening along, if you want to, you can either drop a question into the chat for Matt, or you can wait until I stop the recording and then we'll do the raise your hand and ask a question thing. But I've already asked you this question in a different setting, but this is something that I thought of over and over again, and I think the last question kind of leads into this, but it is a serious question that I wrote as I went through this, wrote right in the front of my book, could a man have written this book? What are your thoughts on that? Tell me your thoughts on that question.
No, that's a good and fair question. I like it. And I think the short answer is no, for some of the reasons that I already gave. Is this just in our society, men are formed in different ways than women are.
Mm,
In many ways, there's these roles that we are, men are seen as more aggressive. I've seen them having more confidence, more readily promoted to authority positions, and women are seen as more nurturing and more submissive and more the helper, or taking care of the details and all that. And so I think that we only get that one perspective. And what I'm inviting us to in this book is something that, a perspective that I am engaging with because of my life experience and my desire not to be so hemmed in all the time, especially in a gender role in any way.
Mm,
And even having that be preached to me or reinforced through the biblical text and saying, but this is a biblical kind of sense of what a woman should be. And I'm going, I don't think you're reading that right. I think you're reading that through male eyes.
yeah.
And I think that's only one way to see it. I think there are other ways to see it. I mean, I see Jesus as having so many feminine characteristics that I think, how can you miss that? But if you're just trained in a certain, to see a certain things, you only see through one set of eyes. So I'm trying to bring my set of eyes through to theology and say, this is what I see through my life experience as a woman in a theological space, having grown up in a quite conservative background and having theology training. This is what I see through my set of eyes. And I invite you to come and see these things, these perspectives, and invite you to look at many different perspectives and see, is there something here that could be helpful and get us out of this kind of claustrophobic way of thinking about God and how we move through the world.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think you do it beautifully. I just, I mean, it's definitely, and I'm not saying this because we're talking right now or that you're a friend. This really is one of my favorite books on theology. Like, there's just it's so rich. It's the kind of book you can go back to again and again, and you're going to uncover new things, fresh perspective. I'm so grateful that you wrote this. It feels both challenging and affirming, and I appreciate it so much, Matt. Thank you.
Thank you.
So much. A couple of questions in the chat that I want to get to before I shut off the recording. Since you're challenging the status quo of standard, Sherry is asking, since you are challenging the status quo of standard theology, how do you find an audience and an outlet for your thoughts? How do you deal with the name calling or trolling that happens as a result of your work? Not
Good
from
question.
Christians, Matt. That wouldn't happen from me.
I'm going to answer the one from Charles first. Is that okay?
Oh, I didn't see that. Where's that
What's
at?
the difference between a dramatic theology degree and a theology degree? My degree is basically interdisciplinary. So I spent some time in the theater department and in the theology department. And my question was, what do they have to say to each other? And most specifically, what can theater and drama teach us as theologians? So that's why I have my emphasis on, character development and story arcs and movement and encounter, which systematic theology tends to be just about abstract concepts and creeds and things like that. So it's bringing more encounter into it.
Yeah, and there's a great section in there on improvisation that scares me to death, but is a great illustration.
Yeah. Well, go to an improv class. I dare you, Brian.
I
I know.
part of what scares me about improv is that I'm afraid of where I would go. That's what scares me most about improv.
Yeah, no, that is the scary part, that we would see part of ourselves or others would see part of ourselves that we're trying to keep hidden.
Exactly.
Really take that filter off when you do improv. Yeah, no, that's fair.
So Sherry asks, since you're challenging the status quo of standard theology, how do you find an audience and an outlet for your thoughts? How do you deal with the name calling or trolling that happens as a result of your work?
Yeah, thanks, Sherry. I haven't had a lot of name calling or trolling, or maybe I just don't hear it. It's happening behind my back. But the whole way that I write, and someone asked, do you write anything about the LGBTQ and this and that? And I said, I actually don't. Maybe I will at some point, but I don't write about issues. I don't address issues because I think where we land on issues comes from how we've already been formed in theology. So I'm backing it way up before we ever get to issues and saying, how do we think about God? How do we engage with community? How narrow are our perspectives in some way? Because that's the only way we've ever seen it. And because of that, we come to a certain conclusions on issues. So I'm trying to get people to back up before we even get to issues and think about more foundational questions. And in that way, it's a little bit easier not to have people put up walls right away, not to have obstacles come up right away. And I do try to be accessible and invitational in how I write and interact with people. So trying to not be provocative, and that is some people's style. That's you do you, but I try not to provoke except to engage. Right? I don't want to push people unnecessarily away. And so far, I think it's really dialed down a lot of possible pushback that I could have had.
Mm.
The main pushback I've had is because I'm a woman speaking ideas. Not because of my ideas, actually. For some reason, I'm not very threatening, and people will just, listen and consider things for the most part. But yeah, I think,
So,
yeah,
so the pushback has been based on gender more than what you're saying.
I think so. I don't know if the people would say that is, but that's what it
Right.
felt like to me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And when you wrote or not wrote, but when you sent out inquiries to publishers, did you were you careful about the publishers you chose, or were you going to some mainstream evangelical publishers who came back with any kind of comments or pushback?
Well, publishing is a whole other thing. I did kind of I had a whole list of publishers, just start, approaching them. And I started with a pretty high bar, go to mainstream publishers that publish a variety of books, but also, evangelical mainstream books, as you say. And I didn't hear back from some of them. And sometimes they just say no, and it's not a good fit. They don't give you any feedback. It depends on the publisher, right? So the one publisher that did give me good feedback was my book doesn't fit a genre neatly, so they weren't looking for that. They were looking for something that was more genre specific. And I think,
Right.
well, I deliberately kind of really stretched the limits of systematic theology because I want to expand it. I think it's done in a way too narrow way and restrictive way
Mm.
and prescribed way. So I wanted to kind of push the boundaries of that. So the main problem I ran into was genre, I think, or maybe they hated it behind closed doors and never told me. But whatever. Yeah, that
Let's
was my
just say genre.
main perception, at least, of how publishers dealt with it.
Yeah. Yeah. Kim says, I'm reading Abuelita Faith now, a touching book that pulls you in. What services in different cultures have you attended, and what have you observed, or how have you been affected?
That's a good question. One of my challenges is because I was in a pastoral leadership for over 20 years, is that I was kind of tied to my home church for most of that. But I have attended the Church of God in Christ Institutional Emmanuel, the Greater Institutional Emmanuel Church of God in Christ in Detroit, one of my favorite churches when we used to drive through there regularly, which is a Black church. And I couldn't explain it. Every time I walked through those doors, I just sat there and wept. And I don't know why. And we were pretty much the only white people in there. So we tried to be very respectful and not draw attention to ourselves and just, go with whatever they're doing. But it found it so deeply moving. And I think because our services tend to be more cerebral, and that was not. That was all about bring your whole self, get your emotions out, be very physical, be embodied. And I think it was just, I just responded to that with weeping, the invitation of embodiment. And I write about this a bit, and it's not a particular church service. I've been to Catholic church services and was part of an Anglican church, and the Mennonite and very conservative Mennonite, where the women sit on one side and the men on the other side, and Reformed. I've been to a lot of the more evangelical or mainline churches, but not too much were different cultures, and that's something I probably would like to do more if I wasn't tied to a specific church. But I write about in the book where going to a powwow, just again, I sit there and just stand there and just weep because something is so, the invitation and the generosity and the hospitality and of being there and not even knowing what I'm encountering because it's different and beautiful and embodied and strong. And there's a sense of belonging that is issued to me, though I'm very clearly an outsider.
Hmm.
That just undoes me. Yeah.